Dr. Sarah Martinez stared at the contract spread across her kitchen table, the number $2 million printed in bold black letters seeming to mock her. The pharmaceutical company's offer was more money than she had ever imagined earning in her lifetime. More money than her parents had scraped together working double shifts at the textile factory. More money than would solve every financial worry she had ever carried. But the catch made her stomach turn. The offer came with one condition. She would have to abandon her mobile medical clinic that served remote villages in Honduras and Guatemala. The pharmaceutical giant wanted her expertise in tropical medicine, her research on rare diseases, and her reputation. They wanted her to join their research team developing treatments for wealthy Western markets. They wanted her to forget about the children who walked barefoot for miles to reach her clinic. Sarah pushed the contract away and walked to her window, looking out at the dusty street where her modified van sat parked. The vehicle that had become her mobile hospital was nothing impressive to look at. Paint peeling from years under the Central American sun, dents from rough mountain roads, and medical equipment secured with bungee cords and determination. Yet this humble van had delivered over 3,000 babies, treated countless infections, and saved hundreds of lives in places where no other medical care existed. The journey to this moment had begun 15 years earlier, when Sarah was a young medical student drowning in debt. She had grown up in a working-class family in Phoenix, Arizona, where her parents had immigrated from Mexico seeking better opportunities. Her father worked construction, her mother cleaned office buildings at night, and both had sacrificed everything to give their daughter a chance at education. Medical school had been Sarah's dream since childhood, inspired by a volunteer doctor who had treated her younger brother's severe asthma for free when her family couldn't afford proper health care. But the dream came with a crushing financial reality. Student loans piled up like snowfall, reaching nearly $300,000 by her final year. The weight of that debt felt heavier than her textbooks, more oppressive than her most difficult rotations. During her residency in emergency medicine, Sarah had planned to specialize in a lucrative field, cardiology, perhaps, or plastic surgery, something that would allow her to pay off her loans quickly and provide the comfortable life her parents had never known. She interviewed at prestigious hospitals, networked with successful physicians, and mapped out a career path that led straight to financial security. Then, everything changed during a medical mission trip to Honduras. The trip was supposed to be a brief vacation, a 2-week volunteer stint to add some humanitarian experience to her resume before settling into serious practice. Sarah arrived at the rural clinic expecting to gain some perspective on global health, treat a few patients, and return home with interesting stories and a broader worldview. Instead, she encountered Maria. Maria was 7 years old, the same age Sarah had been when her own brother had struggled to breathe. But unlike Sarah's family, Maria's parents had no volunteer doctor to turn to, no free clinic within reasonable distance, no hope of accessing treatment for their daughter's severe respiratory infection. The nearest hospital was a 5-hour journey over treacherous mountain roads, and the family had no vehicle, no money for transportation, no way to get help. Sarah watched Maria struggle for breath in her mother's arms, her tiny chest working frantically to pull in air. The infection had progressed far beyond what simple antibiotics could treat. The child needed immediate intervention, proper medical equipment, and intensive monitoring. She needed everything that Sarah could provide in a fully equipped emergency room, but none of it was available in this remote village. Working with limited supplies and equipment that belonged in a museum rather than a modern medical facility, Sarah spent the next 18 hours fighting to save Maria's life. She improvised treatments, adapted procedures, and pushed her medical knowledge to its absolute limits. When Maria finally stabilized and her breathing eased, Sarah felt a satisfaction deeper than anything she had experienced during her years of medical training. But the victory was bittersweet. During those critical hours, 3 other children had arrived at the clinic with conditions that could have been easily treated in the United States. One had a simple fracture that, without proper setting, would likely heal crooked and cause lifelong disability. Another suffered from severe dehydration that had progressed dangerously because clean water wasn't readily available. The third had an infection that would respond beautifully to antibiotics, but the clinic supply had been exhausted weeks earlier. Sarah returned to the United States as scheduled, but she couldn't stop thinking about the children she had left behind. She completed her residency, but every day in a well-equipped emergency room reminded her of the vast inequality she had witnessed. While she treated minor injuries and routine illnesses with access to million-dollar diagnostic equipment, children in Honduras were dying from conditions that cost pennies to prevent and dollars to cure. 6 months after her return, Sarah made a decision that shocked her family, her colleagues, and her financial advisors. She liquidated her savings, sold everything she owned except the essentials, and used the money to purchase and modify a large van for mobile medical service. She learned Spanish, studied tropical medicine, and began planning regular trips to Central America. Her parents were heartbroken. They had worked their entire lives to give their daughter opportunities they never had, and now she was choosing to work for free in places without running water or reliable electricity. Her medical school mentors warned her about throwing away her potential, about the impossibility of making meaningful change without proper resources, about the career suicide of abandoning traditional practice. Sarah listened to all their concerns, acknowledged their love and wisdom, but continued with her plan. She had discovered something during those 18 hours with Maria that no amount of money could replace. She had found her purpose. The first year was brutal. Sarah worked part-time in American emergency rooms to fund her trip south, living on minimal expenses and pouring every spare dollar into medical supplies and vehicle maintenance. She learned to perform complex procedures with basic equipment, to diagnose conditions without advanced imaging, to treat infections with whatever antibiotics she could obtain. More importantly, she learned about the communities she served. These weren't charity cases waiting for rescue. They were resilient people facing impossible circumstances. Farmers who walked hours to bring their sick children to her van. Mothers who had lost previous babies to preventable diseases. Elders who shared traditional remedies that sometimes proved remarkably effective alongside modern medicine. Sarah developed relationships with local health workers, training them in basic medical procedures that could save lives between her visits. She worked with community leaders to identify the most pressing health needs and to develop sustainable solutions. She learned that effective health care in these settings required more than medical knowledge. It demanded cultural understanding, language skills, and the ability to adapt Western medicine to local realities. By her third year, word of Sarah's work had spread throughout the region. Villages that had never seen a doctor were sending messengers to request visits. Local governments began coordinating with her to maximize the impact of her trips. Other medical professionals started joining her missions, inspired by her dedication and the tangible results they witnessed. Sarah's mobile clinic was now saving an average of 30 lives per trip, treating hundreds of patients and training local workers who continued the care between visits. She had delivered babies in the back of her van during mountain storms, performed emergency surgery by flashlight when generators failed, and held dying children whose lives might have been saved with earlier intervention. The work was exhausting, heartbreaking, and often dangerous. Sarah had contracted tropical diseases, been threatened by armed groups controlling remote areas, and watched too many patients die from conditions that would be easily treatable in developed countries. She carried emotional scars from every child she couldn't save, every family she couldn't help in time. But she also carried the memory of Maria, now a healthy 14-year-old who served as a translator during Sarah's visits to her village. She remembered the grandmother who had lived to see her grandchildren born because of a simple heart medication. She thought of a young father who had returned to work after Sarah had reset his badly broken arm, allowing him to continue supporting his family. Now, staring at the pharmaceutical company's contract, Sarah faced the biggest decision of her career. The offer wasn't just about money. It represented security, recognition, and the chance to conduct research that could benefit millions. The company's resources could fund studies into the tropical diseases she encountered daily, potentially developing treatments that could reach far more people than her individual efforts ever could. The rational choice was obvious. Take the money, join the research team, and work towards systemic solutions rather than treating individual patients one at a time. Use the financial resources to create lasting change rather than applying temporary fixes to an endless stream of need. But Sarah knew that accepting the offer would mean abandoning the people who depended on her monthly visits. It would mean leaving villages without any medical care, breaking the relationships she had built over years of work, and turning her back on the communities that had taught her the true meaning of medicine. She thought about Maria, about the promises she had made to pregnant mothers expecting her return, about the local health workers who had become her partners and friends. She thought about her parents, who had finally begun to understand and support her work despite their initial fears. She thought about the young doctors who had joined her missions and were now planning their own humanitarian careers. The contract represented everything she had once thought she wanted. The work in Central America represented everything she had discovered she actually needed. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed the pharmaceutical company's number. When the executive who had been courting her answered, she took a deep breath and prepared to give him her response. But first, she looked out at her van one more time, remembering all the lives it had touched and all the communities it had served. Her decision would determine not only her own future, but the fate of thousands of people who had no other access to medical care. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any student loan, more significant than any salary, more important than any career advancement. At that moment, Sarah realized that the choice wasn't really between money and mission. It was between who she had been trained to be and who she had discovered she truly was. The pharmaceutical company was offering her a chance to return to the path she had originally planned, the secure and profitable career that would satisfy everyone's expectations. But over the past 10 years, Sarah had learned that sometimes the most important work happens far from recognition, far from financial reward, and far from the comfortable assumptions about what constitutes a successful life. She had learned that purpose isn't something you find in a job description. It's something you discover by paying attention to what breaks your heart and what brings you to life. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Soon she would be speaking to people who could change her financial situation forever. In a few minutes, she would give an answer that would reshape her entire future. The weight of the decision pressed against her chest like Maria's tiny hand had years ago, urgent and impossible to ignore. Sarah closed her eyes and made her choice. "Thank you for the generous offer," Sarah said into the phone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "But I have to decline. My work in Central America is too important to abandon." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the pharmaceutical company's chief research officer, had clearly expected a different response. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "Dr. Martinez, I don't think you understand the full scope of what we're offering. This isn't just a salary. We're talking about a signing bonus of $500,000, full relocation assistance, and a research budget that would dwarf anything you could accomplish with your current activities. You could impact thousands of lives instead of dozens." Sarah had anticipated this argument. She had spent weeks weighing the mathematics of impact, calculating how many people she could help directly versus how many might benefit from research funded by her pharmaceutical salary. The numbers seemed to favor the corporate position, but the reality was more complex than any spreadsheet could capture. "I appreciate the opportunity, Dr. Hawthorne, but my answer remains the same. I wish you the best in finding the right candidate." After ending the call, Sarah sat quietly in her kitchen, feeling the weight of what she had just sacrificed. $2 million could have paid off her student loans, bought her parents a comfortable retirement, and funded her mobile clinic for decades. It could have provided security she had never known and opportunities she had always imagined. Instead, she was choosing uncertainty, continued financial struggle, and the endless challenge of providing medical care with minimal resources. She was choosing to remain unknown outside the small communities she served, to work without recognition from the medical establishment that had trained her, to build a career that existed outside traditional measures of success. But as she looked at the photographs covering her refrigerator, pictures of healthy children who had once been her patients, images of communities that had become her second family, snapshots of local health workers who had become skilled medical partners, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. The decision to refuse the pharmaceutical offer marked the beginning of Sarah's most challenging and rewarding period. Word of her rejection somehow reached other organizations, and suddenly she was receiving offers from medical corporations, research institutions, and humanitarian organizations around the world. Each opportunity promised greater resources, wider impact, and financial security. Sarah turned them all down. Instead, she doubled her commitment to the mobile clinic work. She began planning longer trips, expanded her service area to include more remote villages, and started training programs for local health workers that went far beyond basic first aid. She learned that her refusal to join the pharmaceutical company had actually enhanced her reputation within certain circles, marking her as someone whose principles couldn't be bought. 6 months after declining the $2 million offer, Sarah received a call that would change everything. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Pan American Health Organization had heard about Sarah's work and wanted to meet. Unlike the corporate recruiters, Elena wasn't trying to hire Sarah away from her mission. Instead, she wanted to support it. What if we could help you expand your impact without compromising your approach? Elena asked during their meeting in Guatemala City. What if we could provide funding and resources that would allow you to train more local health workers, establish permanent clinics in strategic locations, and develop a model that other mobile practitioners could replicate? The conversation led to a partnership that revolutionized Sarah's work. The Pan American Health Organization provided funding that allowed Sarah to purchase 3 additional mobile units and train teams of doctors and nurses to operate them. Instead of abandoning her hands-on work, Sarah became the coordinator of a network of mobile clinics that served dozens of communities across Central America. But the expansion came with new challenges. Managing multiple teams required administrative skills Sarah had never developed. Training new doctors to work effectively in resource-limited settings demanded teaching abilities she was still learning. Coordinating with government health officials, international organizations, and local community leaders required diplomatic skills that medical school had never addressed. Sarah found herself working 18-hour days, splitting time between treating patients in remote villages and managing the growing organization from a small office in Guatemala City. She was learning to write grant proposals, manage budgets, and navigate the complex politics of international humanitarian work. She was discovering that expanding impact meant accepting responsibilities far beyond direct patient care. The most difficult challenge was maintaining the personal relationships that had always been central to her work. As the organization grew, Sarah found herself spending less time in each community, less time with individual patients, less time building the deep connections that had originally motivated her mission. During one particularly difficult week, Sarah was managing a crisis involving one of her mobile teams when she received word that Maria, the 7-year-old girl whose life had inspired Sarah's career change, was getting married. Maria, now 15, had sent an invitation to her wedding, along with a letter explaining how Sarah's work had not only saved her life, but had inspired her to become a health worker herself. Sarah realized she was too busy with administrative duties to attend the wedding of the girl who had changed her life. The irony was painful. In her effort to help more people, she was losing touch with the individuals who had made the work meaningful. That realization led to another major decision. Sarah restructured the organization, hiring administrators to handle the business operations while she returned to primary focus on direct patient care. She learned to delegate responsibilities she had been trying to manage herself, trusting others to handle logistics while she concentrated on medicine and training. The adjustment wasn't easy. Sarah had to overcome her perfectionist tendencies and accept that others might not do things exactly as she would. She had to learn that effective leadership sometimes meant stepping back rather than taking control. She had to trust that the mission could continue even when she wasn't personally overseeing every detail. But the change allowed Sarah to return to what had originally drawn her to the work. She was back in villages, working directly with patients, building relationships with communities, and training local health workers one-on-one. She was attending weddings, celebrating recoveries, and grieving losses alongside the people she served. 3 years after declining the pharmaceutical offer, Sarah's organization was operating 8 mobile clinics across Central America, had trained over 200 local health workers, and had established permanent clinics in 12 communities. The work was being studied by international health organizations as a model for rural healthcare delivery in developing countries. More importantly to Sarah, child mortality rates had dropped dramatically in every community her organization served. Maternal death rates had declined by over 60%. Preventable diseases that had once claimed dozens of lives annually were becoming rare. Children who would have died from simple infections were growing up healthy, attending school, and planning futures that had once been impossible to imagine. The success brought new recognition and new temptations. Medical journals wanted to publish Sarah's research. Universities offered her teaching positions. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story. Publishers approached her about writing books. Speaking agencies promised lucrative careers on the lecture circuit. Each opportunity represented validation of her work and potential for spreading her message to wider audiences. Each offer promised financial security and professional recognition that had always remained elusive. Each possibility could amplify her impact far beyond what she could accomplish through direct service alone. But Sarah had learned to be suspicious of opportunities that required her to step away from the community she served. She had discovered that her effectiveness came not from her medical degree or her innovative approaches, but from her deep understanding of the people and places where she worked. That understanding could only be maintained through continued presence and ongoing relationships. She began accepting selected speaking engagements and writing opportunities, but only when they could be integrated with her field work. She spoke at medical conferences via video from her mobile clinic, wrote articles during quiet periods between patient visits, and used media attention to highlight the communities she served rather than her own accomplishments. The approach allowed Sarah to maintain her primary focus on direct patient care, while also sharing her experience with broader audiences. She discovered that authenticity was more powerful than polish, that speaking from the field carried more weight than presentations from conference rooms, that her real expertise came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. One evening, while treating patients by generator-powered lights in a mountain village, Sarah received another phone call that would test her resolve. Dr. Hawthorne from the pharmaceutical company was calling again, this time with an offer that had grown to $3 million and included funding for her mobile clinic program. Dr. Martinez, he said, "We've been following your work, and we're more convinced than ever that you're exactly what our research team needs. We're prepared to provide unprecedented resources that would allow you to expand your impact globally while contributing to breakthrough research that could benefit millions." The offer was seductive. $3 million would fund her current operations for decades. The research resources could lead to treatments for the tropical diseases she encountered daily. The global platform could spread her model to every developing country in the world. But as Sarah looked around the clinic where she was working, at the mothers holding sick children, at the local health workers she had trained learning to perform procedures they had never imagined possible, at the community leaders who had become her partners and friends, she realized that the offer still missed the fundamental point of her work. The pharmaceutical company was offering her resources to scale her impact, but they were asking her to abandon the relationships that made the impact meaningful. They wanted her expertise and her reputation, but they didn't understand that her effectiveness came from her commitment to specific people in specific places facing specific challenges. Sarah had learned that sustainable change in global health didn't come from brilliant individuals working in isolation. It came from partnerships between outside resources and local knowledge, from relationships built over years of shared work, from trust earned through consistent presence and demonstrated commitment. "Dr. Hawthorne," Sarah said, cradling the phone between her shoulder and ear while she continued examining a patient, "I'm honored by your confidence in my work, but I have to decline again. My place is here with these communities doing this work. If your company is interested in supporting effective healthcare delivery in developing countries, I'd be happy to discuss how you might fund our training programs or help us expand our model. But I won't be leaving this work to join yours." After ending the call, Sarah returned her full attention to the patient in front of her, a young boy with a respiratory infection that reminded her of Maria all those years ago. As she worked to stabilize his breathing and comfort his frightened mother, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that had originally drawn her to this path. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. No amount of money could buy the fulfillment that came from this work, and no career opportunity could replace the relationships that made it meaningful. Sarah had chosen purpose over profit, community over career advancement, and presence over prestige. The choice had cost her millions of dollars and traditional measures of professional success. But it had given her something far more valuable, a life aligned with her deepest values, work that brought meaning to every day, and the knowledge that she was making a difference in the lives of people who had become her chosen family. As the generator hummed quietly in the background and the mountain village settled into peaceful sleep, Sarah prepared for another day of the work she had chosen over wealth, the mission she had refused to abandon, the calling that defined her life. 5 years had passed since Sarah first declined the pharmaceutical company's offer, and her decision continued to ripple through her life in ways she had never anticipated. The mobile clinic network had grown into something unprecedented in the region, but more importantly, it had become a true partnership between outside resources and local expertise. Maria, the girl whose illness had originally inspired Sarah's mission, was now 20 and working as the coordinator for health education programs across 3 provinces. She had completed nursing school through a scholarship program Sarah had helped establish and had become one of the most effective advocates for rural healthcare in Central America. Watching Maria address a conference of international health officials, speaking confidently about community-based medical care, Sarah felt a pride deeper than any professional accomplishment. The transformation extended far beyond individual success stories. Villages that had once sent urgent messages begging for medical help were now training their own health workers and establishing sustainable healthcare systems. Communities that had lost children to preventable diseases were now celebrating the graduation of local young people from medical and nursing programs. But the most significant change was in how Sarah understood her own role. She had begun her mission thinking of herself as someone who brought healthcare to places that lacked it. Over the years, she had learned that these communities didn't lack healthcare knowledge. They lacked resources and support to implement the health practices they already understood. Traditional healing practices that Sarah had initially viewed with skepticism often proved remarkably effective when combined with modern medical techniques. Local health workers who had seemed uneducated to her medical school trained, I often possessed intuitive diagnostic skills that surpassed many formally trained practitioners. Communities that appeared poor and helpless actually contained sophisticated networks of mutual support and collective problem solving. Sarah's role had evolved from provider to partner, from teacher to student, from rescuer to collaborator. She still brought medical expertise and resources that were unavailable locally, but she now recognized that sustainable healthcare required local ownership, cultural appropriateness, and community leadership. This evolution in understanding led to another major decision. Sarah began transitioning her organization toward complete local control, training community leaders to manage operations, secure funding, and coordinate with government health systems. Her goal was to work herself out of the central role to create a healthcare network that could thrive without depending on her continued presence. The transition wasn't without resistance. Donors who had supported Sarah's work because of her personal story were less enthusiastic about funding operations managed entirely by Central American health workers. International organizations that had partnered with her because of her medical credentials were hesitant to work directly with local leaders who lacked formal degrees but possessed years of field experience. Sarah found herself fighting a different kind of battle, advocating for the competence and leadership of the communities she had served. She spent as much time convincing funding organizations to trust local management as she did treating patients. She discovered that challenging assumptions about who could manage healthcare programs was as important as providing medical treatment. The resistance taught her uncomfortable truths about the humanitarian sector. Many well-intentioned organizations were more comfortable with Western-led initiatives than with locally controlled programs. Donors often preferred supporting charismatic individual leaders rather than sustainable community systems. The same paternalistic attitudes that Sarah had initially brought to her work pervaded much of international development. But Sarah persisted in her transition plan, using her reputation and relationships to secure funding for locally managed programs. She trained community leaders in grant writing, financial management, and organizational development. She connected local health workers with international medical networks, creating partnerships based on equality rather than dependency. During this period, Sarah received another life-changing phone call. This time, it wasn't from a pharmaceutical company or research institution. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Pan American Health Organization was calling to inform her that Sarah had been selected to receive the organization's highest honor for contributions to global health. The award came with a significant cash prize, international recognition, and a platform to influence health policy throughout the Americas. More importantly to Sarah, it represented validation for the community-based approach she had spent years developing and defending. But accepting the award required Sarah to make a choice that had become familiar over the years. She would have to travel to Washington, D.C. for an elaborate ceremony, spend weeks meeting with officials and donors, and likely commit to ongoing speaking and advocacy responsibilities that would take her away from field work. Sarah accepted the award but negotiated the terms of her participation. Instead of a traditional ceremony in Washington, she insisted that the presentation take place in one of the communities where her organization worked. Instead of formal speeches about global health policy, she arranged for local health workers to present their own programs to the international delegation that would attend. The ceremony that resulted was unlike anything the Pan American Health Organization had ever hosted. International health officials found themselves sitting in a simple community center, listening to presentations from indigenous health workers about traditional healing practices integrated with modern medicine. Donors who had expected polished PowerPoint presentations instead observed actual patient care sessions conducted by locally trained medical teams. The unconventional format challenged everyone's assumptions about expertise and authority in global health. Local health workers who had never spoken to international audiences found themselves explaining complex medical concepts to officials from major humanitarian organizations. Community leaders who had been marginalized in previous development initiatives were suddenly recognized as innovative healthcare pioneers. For Sarah, the ceremony represented the culmination of her evolution from individual practitioner to movement builder. She was no longer the central figure in a medical mission. She had become a catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond her personal efforts. But the recognition also brought new pressures and opportunities that tested her commitment to community-based work. Publishers offered substantial advances for books about her experiences. Speaking agencies promised lucrative careers that could fund her organization for decades. Universities created endowed chairs specifically designed to attract her to their faculties. Each opportunity represented a chance to influence global health policy, to change how international organizations approach community health care, to train a new generation of practitioners who understood the importance of local partnership. Each possibility could amplify her message far beyond what she could accomplish through continued fieldwork. The most tempting offer came from her alma mater, which created a new institute for community-based global health and offered Sarah the position of director with complete academic freedom and a budget that would dwarf all her previous resources combined. The position would allow her to train hundreds of medical students in the approaches she had developed, to conduct research that could validate community-based healthcare models, and to influence policy at the highest levels of international health organizations. Sarah spent months considering the university offer, consulting with the community leaders who had become her closest advisors. The conversations revealed the complexity of her decision. Some local partners encouraged her to accept the position, believing that her influence in academic and policy circles could benefit their communities more than her continued field presence. Others worried that her departure would weaken the personal relationships that had made their partnership so effective. Ultimately, Sarah developed a hybrid solution that reflected her hard-won understanding of how sustainable change actually happens. She accepted a part-time position with the university that required only 6 months per year in residence, allowing her to maintain her field work while also training a new generation of practitioners. She insisted that the institute include permanent positions for community health workers from Central America, bringing local expertise directly into the academic environment. The arrangement was unprecedented in academic medicine, challenging traditional hierarchies about who qualified as faculty members and how expertise was recognized. Sarah's insistence on including community health workers as full partners in the academic program forced the university to reconsider its assumptions about credentials, knowledge, and authority. 2 years into her academic partnership, Sarah received one final offer that tested every principle she had developed over her career. The pharmaceutical company that had originally tried to recruit her returned with a proposal that seemed to address all her previous concerns. Instead of asking her to abandon her field work, they offered to fund a massive expansion of her community-based programs while also supporting research into the diseases she encountered daily. The offer was staggering: $50 million over 10 years, funding for mobile clinics throughout Central and South America, scholarships for hundreds of local health workers to pursue formal medical education, and research facilities that could develop treatments specifically for neglected tropical diseases. In exchange, Sarah would serve as the director of the company's new division for global health equity, maintaining her fieldwork while also guiding pharmaceutical development that could benefit millions. For the first time since beginning her mission, Sarah found herself genuinely tempted by a corporate offer. The resources could transform healthcare throughout the region, the research could save countless lives, and the partnership could prove that pharmaceutical companies could pursue both profit and social good. But as Sarah studied the detailed proposal, she discovered clauses that revealed the company's true priorities. The research would focus on diseases that affected wealthy travelers to tropical regions, not the conditions that primarily killed local children. The mobile clinics would be required to collect data for pharmaceutical trials, potentially compromising patient care for research purposes. Most importantly, the company retained the right to terminate the funding if their global health division didn't generate sufficient positive publicity for their brand. Sarah realized that even this seemingly generous offer was still trying to buy her reputation and relationships for corporate purposes. The company wanted to use her credibility and community connections to advance their own agenda, not to support the locally controlled healthcare systems she had spent years building. On a warm evening in the Guatemalan village where her journey had begun, Sarah sat with Maria and other community leaders around the same table where she had once agonized over her first corporate offer. The decision this time was easier, informed by years of experience and clear understanding of her values. "We decline," Sarah said simply when the pharmaceutical executives called for her response. "But we'd welcome your support for our existing programs, with local communities maintaining full control over their healthcare systems." The executives were confused by her refusal and couldn't understand why she would reject resources that could expand her impact dramatically. They offered to negotiate the terms, to address her concerns about corporate control, to find a middle ground that would satisfy everyone. But Sarah had learned that some compromises weren't worth making, no matter how generous they appeared. She had discovered that authentic change required accepting limitations in scale in order to maintain integrity in approach. She had realized that sustainable impact came from empowering communities to control their own health care, not from creating dependency on outside resources, however well-intentioned. As she ended the call and looked around the table at the health workers who had become her colleagues and friends, Sarah felt a contentment that no amount of money could have purchased. She had built something more valuable than a career. She had contributed to a movement that would continue long after her involvement ended. Maria smiled at her across the table, now a confident health leader planning programs that would reach thousands of families. Around them, other community health workers shared stories of their own innovations, challenges they had overcome, and dreams they were pursuing for their villages. Sarah had refused $50 million, just as she had refused $2 million years earlier. She had chosen community over corporate partnership, relationships over resources, sustainability over scale. She had learned that the most important mission in her life wasn't something she could accomplish alone or something that could be bought with any amount of money. Instead, her mission had become part of a larger transformation that belonged to the communities themselves, guided by local wisdom, supported by authentic partnerships, and sustained by the relationships that money could never buy and that no corporation could control. Sarah had discovered that the greatest wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in lives changed, communities empowered, and young leaders like Maria who would carry the work forward long after Sarah's own career had ended. In choosing purpose over profit time, and again, Sarah had found something more valuable than financial success. She had found a way to live that honored both her skills and her values, that contributed to lasting change rather than temporary assistance, and that created a legacy measured not in personal achievement, but in collective empowerment. The woman who couldn't be bought had helped build something that could never be sold, a movement of communities taking control of their own health, their own future, and their own power to create the change they needed most.